Okay, we are here to recognize and discuss National Voter Registration Day, and I am trying to advance slides. There we go. So I am Allegra Hanna. I teach English for the TCC Connect campus, and I serve as the chair of English and Humanities. I'm not a presenter today. I'm just your host. So I will be here to ask questions, monitor the chat, move things along, and introduce everyone. Your presenters today are Ms. Sherri. She's a psychology professor with our campus, and she's going to talk about the subconscious reasons people vote. Professor Misty Wilson-Mehrtens is our history professor and social sciences chair, and she's going to talk about the expansion of democracy. Kenya Wilson is our business and computer science department chair, and she teaches HR. If I'm wrong, please tell me. And she's going to talk about a journey towards suffrage. And Rebekah Adderley teaches speech, and she's our communications department chair, and she is going to talk about voter suppression. I can't ever remember what our departments are called, so I hope I got all that correct. So first we have Sherri to talk to us about the subconscious reasons people vote.
Thank you all for joining us today. There's really quite a bit of research that's gone on the last 50 years that suggests there are multiple factors that influence the way we vote. So first we're going to talk a little bit about political psychologists, what that is and what they do, and decisions that we face each time we vote, the reasons we vote, the emotional affect that influences how we vote, and candidate selection, and what is the likelihood that somebody will turn out to vote. And all of this information is valid and reliable research that's going to be talked about during this section. So for about 50 years, political psychologists have conducted valid and reliable research to determine why Americans vote the way they do. They conduct their research by surveying individuals, and also they've conducted some in laboratory experiments. So each time we go out to vote, whether it's a presidential election or maybe you're voting for a local candidate as mayor or governor, we have decisions that we face. Do we endorse the candidate that agrees with us the most? For instance, if I believe abortion should be accessible to all women, then I might vote for the candidate who, on their platform, wants to keep abortion legal. Or if I'm against abortion, I would probably vote for the candidate who wants to outlaw abortion. Another example are handguns, guns in America. Should we make them harder to buy or make them easier to buy? So this decision could possibly be based on my morals, my values, my thoughts, and I would most likely select the person who is going to agree with me the most. So another issue is, maybe I'm not so concerned about who agrees with me the most. Maybe I want to vote on the person who I think can actually solve the nation's problems, because we do have issues in our nation that somebody needs to solve, right? Or maybe I vote for the candidate who the party, whether it's an independent, Democrat, Republican, maybe I vote for the party that's been most successful in the past. And these are just a few examples of decisions that voters face each time we go to the polls. Our conscious, now, not just when it comes to voting, but any decision you make about anything is influenced by unconscious thought processing. So your emotions, your prejudice may influence, your unconscious thoughts will influence the way you make a conscious decision. Affect is basically another word for emotions. So our emotions, the affect that we experience, is going to influence how we vote. Some emotions such as pride, belonging, peer pressure, fear, disgust, all of these things, these emotions will subconsciously, unconsciously affect the way we make our decisions. Some individuals feel a lot of pride when they go to vote. Others want to belong. So everybody has a need to belong to a group or some group. So if your family or your friends are voting for a particular candidate, you want to have that feeling of belonging to a group. Some individuals will vote out of guilt or shame. You know, if I don't vote, then I really can't complain about anything that's going on in the country, right? So that shame of or guilt of not going to the polls can influence voting. Fear, what if the wrong person is leading our country? We certainly don't want somebody in there running the country who doesn't have the ability or the experience or that causes fear in a lot of individuals. Disgust is a very interesting emotion, and a lot of research has shown that if we're disgusted with one particular candidate, their behavior or their looks, we're more likely to go vote for the other candidate. Prejudice affect our emotions. How we vote is going to affect that as well. Ethnicity, gender, religion are unconscious prejudices that we have. And if I'm going to, let's say I'm Catholic and there's a candidate who is Catholic, I'm more likely going to vote for that particular person. Or gender, if there was a female running for president, I would most likely choose the female candidate based on gender. And I think the only time we did not see that is when Obama was elected for his 2 terms. So I'm not saying that prejudices always affect the way we vote, but they can. We tend to vote for someone who's more like us, those that have our same belief system. So religion, gender, and ethnicity can affect the way we vote in our decision-making process. Other people vote out of altruism, civic duty, and gratitude. Our willingness to be a responsible voter can be affected by civic duty. Most research will show that veterans, anyone who's enlisted in the armed forces, or those who are educated, are more likely to vote. Also, just advancing the collective good with no personal reward of your own, being altruistic can reinforce one's willingness to be a responsible voter. And gratitude. Some individuals feel that, society is going to be grateful if I go and do my job as a responsible voter. So the candidate selection, once you kind of form an impression of an individual, it really does color how we interpret information. Our perception of a candidate, their intelligence, their knowledge, their trustworthiness, their ability to be a strong leader, the impression we have of the candidate that we are attempting to vote for is influenced. And one research project that was conducted at multiple colleges across the nation used, it was the same exact research that came out with the same exact outcome, the same exact answer every time. And what the researchers did is they brought a candidate, an individual, to speak before 3 different groups of students. The first time the candidate spoke, he wore flip-flops and a t-shirt. The second time he spoke to a second group of college students, he wore slacks and a little polo shirt. And the third time he addressed the college students, he wore a business suit. So every time this particular study was conducted, the same outcome was that individuals perceived the man in the business suit as more intelligent, more knowledgeable, and had a better ability to be a strong leader. So perception is going to influence the way one votes. And it's really interesting that one bad thing colors your decision making more than one good thing. So if you learn one bad thing about a candidate, it's going to influence your decision more than learning one good thing about the same candidate. For instance, if you find out that this candidate has avoided the draft or filed for bankruptcy or been unfaithful to his or her spouse, that one negative thing that you learn is going to be more influential than one positive thing that you learn about the candidate. And this is called negativity bias. It's very well documented in the research, and it's our tendency to prefer to remember negative information. And that negative emotions that come along with that dominate the way we make decisions. The likelihood of someone going out to the polls and actually voting, there's multiple reasons there. Some individuals don't have the ability to vote because they're ineligible. One example is having a felony charge. If you were and this varies by state, but in the state of Texas, if you're on parole, you cannot vote. You have to be off parole before you can actually vote. Motivation to vote is going to influence your likelihood to turn out. Some people feel like it makes no difference if I vote or don't vote, so why go? Others dislike a particular candidate, and if you dislike one candidate, you're more likely to go vote for the other candidate just because of your dislike for the other candidate. Also, the level of difficulty can influence turnout at the polls. Some individuals don't have the needed information, where to go to vote, or they don't have the information about each candidate's platform. So they don't have the information they need. Others, maybe they don't have a car, they don't have a babysitter, they have to work, they have to go to school. So the level of difficulty will determine the likelihood of someone turning out to vote. The single most powerful predictor of a person's voting choice is party affiliation. If you affiliate yourself as Republican or you are Democrat or Independent, that is the one most powerful predictor of how an individual will vote. Another research finding was that the more disgusted voters tend to be, the more likely they're going to be politically conservative. So individuals who consider themselves conservatives are going to be more easily influenced to be disgusted about particular candidates' behaviors. And also that how you feel that day is going to influence whether or not you go vote. If you're having a bad day, you might just say forget it. If you're having a good day, you're more likely to show up at the poll. These are just the references of where I've got some of my information. The Journal of Mindful Psychology, Journal of Social Issues, and the BBC. I believe we'll probably have some time at the end for questions, so if you have questions, please hold those to the end.
Thanks, Sherri. So today I'm going to talk about the expansion of democracy, and I want you guys to notice in the title there that there is a question mark. When we talk about expansion of democracy in this country, we tend to tell this as if it's a linear story. A very few small number of people had the right to vote, and then a few more got it, and then a few more got it, and then a few more got it, and then at some point we're a democracy. But I'm going to suggest to you guys today that that's not the full story of American democracy. That actually we've had people that have gained and lost the right to vote, and that this isn't a linear story at all. And so as we go through this, I want you to be asking yourself, at what point is our nation really and truly a democracy? So we are going to start
before colonization with the Iroquois League. So for those of you that have already taken History 1, you probably know this, but the Iroquois League is a group of 5 nations that have formed a confederacy who are inhabiting the Northwest Territory, right where our colonies are established. So right around the area that eventually we're going to see some Puritans and some Jamestown folks show up at. The Iroquois League actually has a confederation that's established sometime in the 1500s that's going to last up until the Revolutionary War. So the historical evidence basically states that during this confederacy, women are going to play a prominent role here. I believe that women have more of an altruistic view of the tribe. They have more of an incentive to keep the tribe going to the next generation because those are their children. So it's female elders who are going to nominate the chiefs or speakers to represent each tribe at the League's council. So this works somewhat the way our Senate works today. Each tribe selects members who go off to the council, and the council is going to make all the decisions. So women are essentially going to nominate those candidates, but then it's men who are all nominated. This is really our first sort of representative democracy in the United States, or what will be the United States. Unfortunately, this is going to be lost when we get to the Colonial Era. You're right, Allegra. You can go to the next one. So during the Colonial Era, we're going to see that each colony establishes its own rules for who can vote and their logic for that. So in 1620, the Mayflower lands and the Puritans jump off the boat and they establish our first representative democracy via a document. They're going to give us the Mayflower Compact. So the Mayflower Compact states that its members of the church would create a civil body politic for the purpose of passing just and equal laws for the general good of the colony. So that sounds good to us. Church members get to pass laws and vote on laws. However, in the Puritan church, who could become a church member is pretty limited. So only adult, self-sufficient males could be a member of the church. So if you're 40 years old but you still live at home with your parents, you can't be a member of the church. And other members of the church can vote you in or out. So you can check all the right boxes, but if you're kind of a jerk and nobody on the Mayflower likes you, you don't get to vote. So this is a form of self-government, but it's a very limited form of self-government. This also essentially creates a religious test for holding office. If you want to hold office in Massachusetts Bay, you have to be a Puritan. So there are no Catholics, there are no Quakers, there are no Baptists who get a say in the government. Most of our colonies are going to have some sort of religious test. For example, Maryland is founded by Catholics. So early on in Maryland, you need to be a Catholic to hold office. But eventually our colonies are going to move away from that, and they start doing this idea of a freeholder. So a freeholder is an adult male who owns land or property worth a certain amount of money. If you were an adult freeholding male, and adult means 21 or above, then you have quote-unquote skin in the game. You have a stake in society, and therefore you can be trusted with the vote. They did not give the vote to people that didn't own property because there was this idea that those people might vote to take the property away from the people that had it and redistribute it. So they're not going to do that. Because this is based on property and adult maleness, we are going to have a couple of colonies that allowed free black men to vote, including New York and New Jersey. But that's going to end by the time we get to the Civil War. So New York allows it all the way up until the Dred Scott decision right before the Civil War. New Jersey ends the black vote in 1807 and Pennsylvania in 1838. The first state that's going to give us full adult white male suffrage is going to be Vermont in 1777. So at this point, we've only been talking about males. There was, though, a call early on to remember the ladies. That's a pretty famous quote from a letter written by Abigail Adams asking her husband, John, to remember the ladies when they're drafting the new government. And, of course, he writes back to her and says that that's a great joke, and she's very funny, but no. During the Colonial Era, We have several colonies that have women have the right to vote. New York, eventually Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New Jersey. Now, in New Jersey, it was a mistake. They wrote all adults in the language, and they forgot to include the word male. But still, for 10 years, women had the right to vote. However, much like black men, women started to lose the right to vote in the 1770s. So the same year that all white and male adults get the right to vote in Vermont, women lose the right to vote in New York. 1777, women lose the right to vote in New York. In 1780, they lost it in Massachusetts. 1784, they lose it in New Hampshire. So this alone right here tells us from both of these experiences that the right to vote should not be taken for granted. It's something you must constantly guard. In the Western states, in the 1830s, we start to see women get the right to vote back. But that's not because the Western states are more egalitarian or they're more enlightened. It's because there's not that many people there, and they need a common way to pass on property and essentially land ownership. So Kentucky in 1838 gives women who are the heads of their households, meaning their husband has died. Women who are heads of the household have the right to vote. Again, this is to keep property within the families. In 1787, on the next slide, we see the Constitution passed. All right, so once the Constitution is adopted, we tend to think that the Constitution creates this federal system of voting, but that's not true. To get it ratified, that was weird. To get it ratified, we have to make some compromises here. So the compromise that's made is that the states will get to decide who votes. So in 1787, most states are going to decide that it's white, adult, 21 and above, male landowners who should have the right to vote because they have the most at stake in society. So to put this in perspective for you guys, when George Washington is elected president, only 6% of our population can vote. So I know that we say that we're a representative democracy in 1787, but if only 6% of the population can vote, I think we should really question how freely we're using that word. We are going to see the repeal of the property requirement by the 1820s. A lot of that is from the Jacksonian influence. Andrew Jackson is a man of the people, comes up from the poor. So if Jackson can be president, then everyone should be able to vote. And that's going to get us basically to the Civil War amendments. So if we can go one more slide forward. The Civil War amendments include the 13th, 14th, and 15th. For our purposes today, it's the 14th and 15th that are most important. So the 14th Amendment states that all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States, and the United States shall make no or enforce no law which shall abridge their rights to vote. So that sounds great. 14th Amendment is targeted at former slaves. These former slaves are now citizens, and citizens should have the right to vote. Unfortunately, it's not acknowledged that way universally. So while California would say, yeah, of course, former slaves should have the right to vote, the South should definitely do that, they don't include Asian Americans in that, and especially Asian immigrants. So from the 1880s to the 1940s, we have Asian immigrants who've become naturalized. They've become citizens, and yet we have these state and federal laws that prevent them from voting. And what you're seeing in the background there is a picture taken from Chinatown in San Francisco. This really is an ongoing issue in the Western states of these Asian Americans not being able to vote. And that's interesting because the Western states are allowing women to vote. So again, we have an issue here of equality and applying these laws fairly and justly. If we go to the 15th Amendment, stay on the same slide though. We go to the 15th Amendment. The common understanding of the 15th Amendment is that it protects the right to vote of these freed slaves. That's actually not what it does. What the 15th Amendment does is prevents discrimination against those that got citizenship in the 14th Amendment. But without providing any kind of teeth to that law, like there's no punishment for a state that doesn't follow it. There's no fines. There's no possibility of anybody in the state going to jail. It's very hard to hold people accountable. The 15th Amendment also doesn't account for nationality, ethnicity, or gender. So again, we're still leaving out a pretty good chunk of people. The 19th Amendment, again, we generally say, oh, the 19th Amendment is when women got the right to vote. 1920, all women can vote. Not really. So the 19th Amendment doesn't cover Native American women, Black women, or Latino women, Asian American women. So some women got the right to vote. We still have a poll tax in the 1920s. We still have all-white primaries in the 1920s. So still a lot of barriers there. So in the Civil Rights era of the 1960s, now we can get, there we go. We're going to see a push for two things. One, the barriers to voting start to come down, and this culminates in the 26th Amendment. I'm not going to talk about that because I know a couple of our other speakers are going to, but I want you to know that this is a fight that's in the national atmosphere. We're discussing it, we're debating it, we're fighting over it. And then we're going to get to the 26th Amendment. So the 26th Amendment is one that we don't talk about, I don't think, enough. The 26th Amendment is going to lower our voting age to 18. Up until this point, pretty much every state has had it at 21. But through the 1960s and 1970s, we fought in Vietnam. And I gave you guys the numbers here because I really do think that this is important to look at. During the Vietnam War, we had 33,000 18-year-olds killed, 12 17-year-olds killed, 5 16-year-olds killed, and even one 15-year-old killed. All of those men that died in Vietnam that were under the age of 21 didn't have the right to vote. So there's this idea and this slogan, they're old enough to fight, but they're not old enough to vote. So we're going to see that corrected, and Nixon's going to be the president that gets to sign that. So 18-year-olds now across the country are going to give in the right to vote. All right, so if we can go one more slide forward. Awesome. As you listen to these other speakers who are going to talk to you about the barriers to voting and voter suppression, I want you guys to keep these questions in mind. When you're looking at a certain group, when did this group get the right to vote? Did they keep the right to vote? Did all members of that group get the right to vote? And when we're talking about the right to vote, are we talking about local, state, federal? And are we talking about primaries, or are we talking about general elections? Because when we're really thinking about these big ideas of democracy, it helps to get down into the details and really sort it out. And with that, I'm going to hand this over to Professor Kenya Wilson to talk to us about the barriers.
Hello, hello, hello. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Kenya Wilson, and today I'm going to cover a very brief history of suffrage in the United States. And I say that as a disclaimer because if there's any information not covered, please understand that it's because many of the topics we're covering today could be sessions within themselves. So I'm going to focus on major highlights in my section of the presentation. As we have seen, and as Misty talked about, the right to vote has been a contentious issue in the U.S. since inception. Initially, there was no specific right to vote or qualifications to vote drafted in the Constitution. In fact, what we are seeing today has only existed for a few decades, and it has taken us 240 years and counting, not to mention the hard work of millions of Americans through history to get where we are today. That's why in the midst of this controversial and incredibly close election, it's important to recognize the true value in history of the vote and the importance of every vote that is cast. So we're going to start with the Declaration of Independence. So the Articles of Confederation, which were the first set of laws for the 13 original states, were written with urgency during the Revolutionary War. At the time, the authors of these articles were most focused on defining the U.S. as an independent nation, so they really didn't outline much on how to actually run the country, leaving most of the details up to the states. This didn't work very well because the focus really wasn't on running the country. So issues such as voting rights were not focused on and left to the states, while most states only allowing white Protestant property-owning males to cast a ballot. So in comes the Constitution in 1787. And even then, and despite their beliefs in the virtues of democracy, the nation's founders accepted and endorsed severe limits on voting. The U.S. Constitution originally left it to the states to determine who was qualified to vote in elections. And for decades, the states continued to restrict voting to white males who owned property. Some of the states even employed religious tests to ensure that only Christian men could vote. Next slide. Thank you. So then we see the establishment of the Electoral College in 1788, which is established via the Article 2 of the Constitution. And it specifies that the U.S. President is elected by representatives to the Electoral College, which is a group of people who are appointed from each of the states through a process established by each state legislature. Every state gets the number of electors equal to the number of its representatives and senators in Congress. The creation of the Electoral College then gives more power to smaller states rather than letting the people in the most populous states control who becomes president. In the event of a tie vote in the college, the House of Representatives gets to choose the president. So we'll continue. So as we look at those initial institutions set up to really support voting, even with all of its restrictions, we start to see slow progress towards change made in 1810. This is when we see the religious requirement for voting being completely removed. This change follows with New Hampshire becoming the first state to eliminate the rule that only property owners and taxpayers could vote. Following their lead, other states begin to shift away from such restrictions in an effort to open the electorate to all white males. This, however, wasn't complete until around 1845, with North Carolina becoming the last state to eliminate the rule that citizens must own property to vote, effectively extending the right to vote to all white men, including migrants, transients within the United States. So now we'll talk about the beginning of the crusade for women's suffrage really starting to make an impact in Seneca Falls. Although this wasn't the first initial event to mark the fight for women's rights, it's one of the most impactful. Seneca Falls marks the event where about 300 activists, including 40 men, gather for a 2-day convention in Seneca Falls, New York, to strategize and meet on how to obtain women's suffrage nationwide. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, along with 60 other women and 32 men, sign and issue the Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions, which is modeled on the Declaration of Independence. And this calls for the equal treatment of women and men under the law, as well as voting rights for women. Also present at Seneca Falls was former slave Frederick Douglass, who addresses the crowd, showing unity between the anti-slavery and women's rights movements. 2 years later, the first National Women's Rights Convention is held in Worcester, Massachusetts, and attracts more than 1,000 participants, really coming together to fight for women's voting rights as well. As we'll see here in 1896, the fight for voting rights wasn't always an easy one. So disagreements over the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments and the relationship between women's suffrage and the movement for racial equality begins to split the women's rights movement, with allegiances divided between two main organizations. Those organizations are the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association. With the passage of the 15th Amendment, which was the first step towards ratification, this granted the right to vote to men of color and former slaves, but not to women. And the National Women's Suffrage Association, led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, broke their abolition and Republican supported ties. They accused them of emphasizing civil rights for African Americans at the expense of women's rights, And the two of them began to lobby for constitutional amendments to give women the right to vote at a federal level. At the same time, the American Women's Suffrage Association worked for voting rights state by state. So the first organization focused on voting at the federal level, while the second one focused on voting for the states. So now we will go on to 1875, where the drama just continues to unfold. And the United States' views on women's voting rights are further solidified in 1875, where in Minor versus Happersett, the U.S. Supreme Court upholds a Missouri law that allows only men to vote. It rejects a claim by Virginia Minor, who was not allowed to register to vote, that the law denies her one of the privileges or immunities of citizenship guaranteed in the 14th Amendment. The court says in this case, while women are persons under the 14th Amendment, that they are a special category of non-voting citizens, and that states remain free to grant or deny the women the right to vote. And we'll see, if you look further into history, you'll see that a lot of the laws that were made to really silence women were made under the disguise of us needing to be, we're these weak creatures that need to be protected. So this is kind of the same sentiment that was shared here when the women's right to vote was still denied in this case. So we'll go ahead and continue and talk about Reconstruction ending in 1877, where voting by freed African Americans dramatically changes the political climate in southern states, enabling Black candidates to win seats in Congress and state legislatures. As a part of an agreement that settles the disputed election of 1876, President Rutherford B. Hayes orders the removal of troops from the states still under Reconstruction. He hopes that this move will bring the North and South together. However, it's the withdrawal of the troops and the end of the federal oversight of elections that really led to many Southern Blacks losing their voting rights that they had exercised since emancipation. And so this is where we start to begin to see a lot of the voter suppression that African Americans and other minorities begin to experience, which will be covered later by another presenter in this presentation. All right, so as you can see, the vote or the journey towards suffrage has been a roller coaster, and we get where we see lack of progress, we start to see progress. It's demonstrated in 1890. So while one can gain progress alone, with the help of others, people can soar even higher, making even greater impact. And this was demonstrated in 1890 when the two rival women's voting rights groups, the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association, merged to form one organization called the National American Women's Suffrage Association. So the two groups who split over, conflicting issues, they merged to become one again, working for the passage of a constitutional amendment to guarantee women the right to vote. So the fight continues. They squash all of, any conflict that they have, and they decide to work together for the voting rights for most women. However, minority groups such as African Americans and Native Americans are still struggling with discrimination. So as we talked about earlier, African American males were given the right to vote, and other minority groups of males that were given the right to vote, but they are still struggling with discrimination and voter suppression as it relates to voting in around 1915. The U.S. Supreme Court in United States versus Mosley extends its previous ruling in Ex parte Yarborough when it upholds a conviction under the Federal Civil Rights Act. Election officials in Blaine County, Oklahoma, had refused to count the ballots in a federal election in 11 of their precincts, where there were minority voters. The court said, "We regard it as equally unquestionable that the right to have one's vote counted is as open to protection by Congress as the right to put a ballot in the box." Alrighty. So now we go shift back to women's suffrage. And in 1916, the fight begins to start to close. And so the National Women's Party organizes protests at the White House in support of women's voting rights. Mrs. S.H.B. Gray of Colorado writes, "I have no son to give my country to fight for democracy abroad, and so I send my daughter to Washington to fight for democracy at home." So in the protest, many of the demonstrators were arrested and charged with obstructing traffic. Alice Paul, the party leader, argues one to judge, we do not consider ourselves subject to this court, since as disenfranchised class, we have nothing to do with the making of the law, which has put us in this position. Some of them were imprisoned due to their refusal to pay their fines. However, after the party publicizes their harsh conditions and treatment in prison, they are pardoned by President Woodrow Wilson in 1917. A few years later, the fight for women's voting rights sees a huge victory. After a 72-year fight, the ratification of the 19th Amendment formally guarantees the women the right to vote. Which, as we know, as Misty said earlier, was really just extended to some women because minority groups still suffer. It's quietly signed into law at a ceremony to which the press and suffragists were not even invited. Upon the ratification of the 19th Amendment, the National American Women's Suffrage Association establishes the League of Women Voters to encourage women to use their newly acquired right to vote. Next, we move forward to 1957, where minority groups begin to gain a bit of progress. In response to low voter registration amongst African Americans, President Eisenhower proposes the Civil Rights Act of 1957, the first since Reconstruction. This law basically creates the Civil Rights Commission to investigate acts of interference with citizens' rights to vote and to monitor other civil rights abuses. The right to vote for those residing in the nation's capital has also been a bit convoluted. The 23rd Amendment grants people in the District of Columbia the right to vote in presidential elections. The District of Columbia is to have electoral votes equal to the number it would have if it were a state, but no more than the least populated state. And then we begin to see civil rights victories for minority voters. It's often overlooked that self-government in America was practiced by Native Americans long before the formation of the United States. Yet, Native Americans also faced many of the same hurdles as African Americans and women's. This begins to change in the 60s. So, responding to civil rights protests in the South, Congress passes the Civil Rights Act of 1964, where basically the law prohibits discrimination in public accommodations, employment, education, and government services. And it also strengthens the 15th Amendment by prohibiting discrimination in voting and makes voting requirements more uniform. However, finding that these anti-discrimination laws, particularly the Civil Rights Act, weren't sufficient to overcome the resistance, Congress adopts the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to further enforce the prohibition of discrimination for African American and other minority voters. So this is where you see minority groups really gain victory in their right to vote. Lastly, over the years and even still today, we still have witnessed continued suffrage issues such as voting rights for convicted felons, where most states today still have differing policies on felons' right to vote. We see in 1975, the Overseas Citizens Act, Voting Rights Act passed, giving people residing outside of the U.S. as citizens the right to vote via absentee ballot. We also see the Voting Accessibility for the Elderly and Handicapped Act requiring polling places make and provide aids to those with disabilities and at the elderly, making it more physically accessible. And then we have, in 1986, the voting rights for military and citizens rights solidified via the Overseas Citizens Voting Right Act of 1975, giving them the same rights as previously as the Overseas Citizen Act, giving them the right to vote via absentee ballot. And even today, we're still seeing microaggressions and continued challenges with voting equity via voter suppression. And Professor Adderley will discuss those issues in detail next. So I will pass it to her.
Thank you, and hello everyone. So I am Professor Adderley, and I will be talking about voter suppression. To start, we'll clarify what that means. Voter suppression is any effort, either legal or illegal, by way of laws, administrative rules, and or tactics that prevent eligible voters from registering to vote or from voting. And so what we'll do, first we'll talk about some of the voter suppression tactics that have occurred throughout history. Then we'll look at some important legislation that sought to curb voter suppression, some present-day voter suppression tactics that we should all be aware of, and finally we'll talk about what you can do if you feel like you're experiencing voter suppression. So let's start with some forms of voter suppression that have been experienced in the past. So you've heard poll taxes being referenced. The poll tax was basically a tax that you had to pay in order to vote. And at one time, they were common across the board, but by the mid-20th century, they were mainly limited to the South as a means of preventing blacks and poor whites from voting. They were abolished by the 24th Amendment. And the funny thing is, that was in 1964. Texas did not ratify that amendment until 2009. And there are actually a handful of other states who have still not ratified that amendment, but they were abolished in 1964. So why Texas took so long and why some other states still have not done it, kind of interesting, but good to know. Other voter suppression tactics were police intimidation. So police forces would routinely intimidate and harass African Americans who tried to register to vote or who went to go vote, and people would be arrested on false charges. And in some cases, they would say, oh, you did this or you did that, and it would be, you'd be arrested. In some cases, people were beaten, and this was not just limited to men. There were accounts of women and even family members and children falling victim to this as well. With economic retaliation, this is really interesting. So throughout the Deep South, there were citizens' councils that were formed by white business people, employers, banks, landlords, and it was interesting because they wanted to, they were anti-integration, and they would, for example, if you were a black person or if you were a white person who was pro-integration, they would, if you tried to vote, you'd lose your job, or they would, you get evicted, or you try to get a bank loan, you couldn't do it. And if you were a white business owner who was pro-integration, they would boycott your business and make sure that you went out of business. So the economic retaliation was very serious throughout the Deep South. And according to a PBS report, their numbers in the state of Mississippi, they grew to about 80,000. By 1956, they had about 80,000 members. And the councils initially were formed because after Brown versus the Board of Education desegregated schools and abolished legal segregation, a lot of those people were very disgusted, as Sherri talked about, and they did not want integration. They wanted to keep it segregated. So that's when the councils first began to form. And so they would also come together to prevent voting, and they were referred to as the Uptown Clan. They were perceived as a little bit better than the Ku Klux Klan, so they were called sometimes the Uptown Klan. But these councils would inflict economic retaliation to keep people from voting. And so then you have domestic terrorism with KKK, and this involved violence, cross burnings, night ridings, beatings, rapes, church bombs, arson of business and homes, murder and lynch mobs, things of that nature. And so by the establishment during those times, these people were considered to be, defenders of Southern way of life and upholders of glorious Southern heritage. And so there was nothing that really happened if they, did conduct lynchings or, burn crosses in people's yard or burn people's homes down. And in fact, lynchings a lot of times were advertised in newspapers, postcards, and people just kind of accepted it as, something that happened. There was not really this huge, like, oh my God, they lynched someone. It was kind of like a normal thing. And so that was another tactic that would be used to keep people from voting. And there are some pictures, I didn't want to include that because that's a traumatic thing to see, but there are actually pictures, you can find them online, of people who have been lynched, and there's a sign that said, this N-word voted, or this N-word tried to vote. So you could, if you're interested in that kind of stuff, you could look that up online, but I didn't want to put the pictures here, obviously, because it's very gruesome. But it's a sad and unfortunate part of, our nation's history. So let's move on to literacy tests. So literacy tests were tests used in many places before the passage of the Voting Rights Act to deny Black people and certain white people the right to vote. And so this is an example of a literacy test from the state of Louisiana. And this is an excerpt. You see that it has a 10-minute time limit. This test actually had 30 questions. And if you look at some of these test questions, it's literally impossible, and it's very tricky, and it's meant to be tricky. It's meant to, have the test taker struggle and fail. So the first one, draw a line around the number or letter of this sentence. That's really difficult to understand what that means. You could probably try to figure out, but they're designed for the person who administers the test to be able to say, nope, got it wrong. And what they would do with these literacy tests, the person who was administering or in charge of voting or word registration, they would determine whether or not you passed. And of course, disproportionately, people of color would not pass the test. And so also when you went to apply to vote, you had to swear that you were well disposed, and again, this is in the state of Louisiana, this is one example, swear that you were well disposed to the good order and happiness of the state of Louisiana, and you will fully abide by the laws of this state. That pretty much provided a pretext for the registrar to ban anyone who was known to oppose racial segregation or anyone who had, defied a segregation law. Maybe you were integrating in some area and, they were like, well, no, you don't uphold the laws because you won't segregate. So that was another interesting thing that I found. And you can look at, there's so many different voter literacy tests available online. So there was a video that I saw once. They had some Harvard students attempt to take the literacy test. And it was really interesting because, of course, no one could really pass it because it makes no sense. So if you get a little bit of time, look up some of the other literacy tests that were being used around the country, and just to get an idea of the things that they would make you do to try to prevent you from voting. Okay, so next, talk about Native and Indigenous voter suppression. So Native Americans were granted citizenship and the right to vote in 1942. However, many states continue to actively suppress their voting rights. And so, for example, before that time, there was a law that said only people who paid taxes could vote. And if you lived on a reservation, you were tax exempt, which means you were ineligible to vote, and that law wasn't rescinded until the 1970s. Another example of the location of the election offices in public places were significantly far away from your reservation. So if you lived in a reservation and you didn't have a vehicle or some way to get to the election office, you couldn't vote and there was no public transportation. And also, a lot of them lack traditional mailing services, and in some instances, post office boxes were 40 miles away from the reservation and they weren't checked regularly. So that's another way. And in some areas, absentee voting in certain Native American reservations, absentee voting is the main way that they vote. But to be able to get those ballots to a mailbox is very difficult, even today. And so next, let's talk about some legislation. So two important things. First, there's a Voting Rights Act of 1965 that was referenced earlier. And basically, it prohibited, rights to vote being based on literacy tests on a nationwide basis, no literacy tests. And it required that, the places in the country that had a history of voter suppression and discrimination, they had to receive pre-clearance of any voting procedure changes from the federal government. So they couldn't just make a change, because they just felt like, oh, we're just going to change this rule. Because that was what people did to suppress votes. They make specific rules to keep specific people from voting. And so an attorney general could request that federal observers monitor activities within your polling place. So that's what happened with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But Shelby versus Holder weakened the Voting Rights Act of 1965. They removed the requirement for pre-clearance of voting procedure changes. So now people don't have to clear it in advance when they have procedural changes. And as a result, many states were free to just implement laws that suppress the rights of marginalized groups. And let me give you the Supreme Court's, the majority decision. This was Chief Justice John Roberts. He said, well, if Congress had started from scratch in 2006, it plainly could not have enacted the present coverage formula. Regardless of how one looks at the record, no one can fairly say that it shows anything approaching the pervasive, flagrant, widespread, and rampant discrimination that faced Congress in 1965. And that clearly distinguished the covered jurisdictions from the rest of the nation. So he's basically saying, well, if you looked at it, currently, the things that were happening in 1965 aren't anywhere near, what's happening now. So we don't really need it anymore, because if we had done this, in 2006, we wouldn't have put all these safeguards in place. The dissent was given by Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and she said, throwing out pre-clearance when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you are not getting wet. So, next slide. So let's look at some of the present day forms of voter suppression. So we have things that are still happening, unfortunately, like gerrymandering, when the district redistricting is conducted in a way that draws the lines to manipulate the outcome of the election. So it's a widespread, undemocratic practice, and it stifles the voices of millions of voters. You have certain voter ID laws that are discriminatory. Some places they limit early voting dates. This was one of the things that I saw with the Native communities, because some of the reservations are in remote locations. They are really far away from the voting places. So they had some satellite voting locations that they would provide, but they would only provide it for a very small window of time. And if you couldn't make it during that small window, you got to go to the, really, really far out place. And if you don't have transportation, or your own transportation or public transportation, that would be problematic. Also, you have limiting polling locations. And some places, they will limit your polling locations to maybe to one place, but there's hundreds of thousands of voters who need to vote. And so as a result, you see ridiculously long lines, people standing in line for 6 hours. And obviously that disenfranchises people who you may have to work, or you're elderly, or you're disabled. That could be very problematic. It is very problematic. And so also you have restricting election day resources and voter roll purges, where if you haven't voted for a few years, they could just purge you from the record, and then you don't even know that you're no longer registered to vote. Your registration has been pretty much voided, and then you show up to vote. It's like, surprise, you were purged from the roll, but now it's too late to register, and you got to sit that one out, right? And so let's look at the next one. And so who's impacted by voter suppression? So 70% of Georgia voters were purged from the rolls. And 70% of the Georgia voters that were purged from the rolls. Yes, Kennedy? Okay, baby, go play. Sorry, got a toddler breach. 70% of the voters that were purged in 2018 were Black. Across the country, 1 in 13 Black Americans cannot vote due to disenfranchisement laws. 1/3 of the voters who have disabilities have difficulties voting. 40% of the polling places fully accommodate people with disabilities. Nationwide, you have counties with larger minority populations who have fewer polling sites and fewer poll workers per voter. And then you have 6 in 10 college students who come out of state in New Hampshire while the state is trying to block residents with out-of-state driver's licenses. So to wrap up, here's some things you can do. This slide and the next slide just shows if you are, make sure you want to register to vote early if you can, because the lines have been very long. You can contact the ACLU. You can report suspicious incidents to local election officials. And then this last slide just gives some additional numbers, election protection hotlines in different languages. And you can also text Our Vote to 97779.
Thank you, Rebekah. So we just want to remind everyone that the deadline to register to vote is October 5th. That in the state of Texas, early voting was extended. It's now October 13th through 30th. And again, as many of our presenters have urged, we would recommend voting early for those of you eligible and register to vote so that you can avoid the longer lines and so that you can go to precincts that might be more, or voting locations that might be more convenient for you. Election day, if you do wait for the last day to vote, is November 3rd, and you need to go to your precinct if you vote on election day. Today is National Voter Registration Day, and that's why we are here to present this information to you. I will say that if you were here from 1 to 2 and you have things to do at 2 p.m., you're welcome to leave. But if you have questions and you want to stick around, you're welcome to sign off. And you'll see Professor Wilson just posted in the chat the link to click to put your attendance in. Sorry, I forgot the word attendance. So the Google form is linked in the chat, and you can get your credit and document your attendance by going to that link and filling out that Google form. And again, we will stick around to answer questions, but if you need to leave, we totally understand. Thank you for being here with us, and thank you to our presenters for sharing all of this amazing information.